from the diary of Anne Frank.
Hello and welcome everyone. When I first read the diary of Anne Frank at a young age, the horrors of the Holocaust did not become very apparent because of the way Anne wrote, with an undaunting spirit of hope.
Yes, you almost begin to believe that the diary will end on a positive note until reality strikes you.
Today we are going to read two of the initial journal entries by Anne Frank when her life was still like any other 13-year-old girl. So, let me begin the proceedings with the introduction. Story. From the Diary of Anne Frank is an abridged excerpt from the Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. It was first published under the title Het Achterhuis, Dagboek Brieven, 14 Juni 1942, zu 1 Augustus 1944. The Annex. Diary Notes 14 June 1942 to 1st August 1944. Anne-Lise Marie Anne Frank was born on 12 June 1929. She received the diary as a gift on her 13th birthday, 12th June 1942, and shortly after that, her diary entries began. The quoted entry in the chapter is one of the few made while she was still living a normal life, because the next month, the family had to go into hiding. She was living in Amsterdam at the time, which came under Nazi occupation in 1940, and the Jewish deportations began in mid-1942. Anne Frank and her family survived for 2 more years in hiding. In August 1944, they were betrayed and reported to the Nazis and sent to concentration camps. Anne died soon after of typhus. The Nazis were defeated and the war ended few months after Anne's death. Her father, the only survivor in the family, discovered Anne's diary and got it published by Contact Publishing in Amsterdam in 1947. Since then, her diary has been translated to almost all major languages and has become one of the world's most read, renowned, and studied books of all time. Anne Frank herself has become one of the most renowned and discussed Holocaust victims. Anne Frank, the child victim of the Holocaust. Although the given text does not include any of the troubled times, Anne Frank's diary as a whole remains to this day as an honest, innocent account of wartime life, the humanity of some people meeting the inhumanity of other people. It gives us a rare insight into the thoughts and emotions of a sensitive child with a huge spirit and a larger faith in humanity facing history's cruelest atrocity of man versus man, Holocaust and World War II. Her record of her everyday experiences, struggles, responses, and coping mechanisms are a treasured testimony to the extremities of horrors as well as to extremities of hope that human beings are capable of. Besides Anne Frank, there have been other accounts of Holocaust by children, like the diaries of David Shirakowiak, Eva Heyman, and Yitzhak Rudashevsky. Like Anne, neither of these children survived the Holocaust. Perspective. Being a series of journal entries, the story follows a first-person limited narration and is full of personal observations, musings, and confessions.
Thank you. Let me take up the explanation now. Anne Frank had no idea her life would touch millions of people all over the world long after her death. Writing in a diary is a really strange experience for someone like me. Someone like me. It sounds like she finds herself somewhat different from those around her. It seems to me that later on neither I nor anyone else will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old schoolgirl. Maybe they will think it is too childish or too foolish to read or remember. But is that why one writes a diary? Definitely not. Oh well, it doesn't matter. I feel like writing. Now that's a good reason to write. But more than that, I have an even greater need to get all kinds of things off my chest. What kind of things can someone so young have to write about? But she cannot just start spilling secrets and sorrows. Such faith and courage takes time. And she can manage to take her time, starting somewhere very vague. Paper has more patience than people. I thought of this saying on one of those days when I was feeling a little depressed and was sitting at home with my chin in my hands, bored and listless, wondering whether to stay in or go out. Anne seems a bit confused whether she was just bored or depressed. This means that actually she is just lonely. I finally stayed where I was, brooding. If she decided against going out and meeting people, she must have known it won't help. Maybe there is nobody with whom she can feel fulfilled. Yes, paper does have more patience. And since I am not planning to let anyone else read this stiff-backed notebook grandly referred to as a diary, unless I should find a real friend, it probably won't make a difference. So she is still trying to convince herself to start writing in the diary. She is slightly amused by the concept of diary keeping, but she doesn't have a real friend, so she needs a good substitute. Now, I'm back to the point that prompted me to keep a diary in the first place. I don't have a friend. Wait before telling her she is exaggerating things. Let me put it more clearly, since no one will believe that a 13-year-old girl is completely alone in the world. And I'm not completely alone. I have loving parents and a 16-year-old sister, and there are about 30 people I can call friends. A family, loving aunts, and a good home. She has all the care and comfort and company she needs. What she doesn't have is a connection, not with any of them. All I think about when I'm with friends is having a good time. Temporary distractions, ordinary, everyday things. There is a clear longing for sharing extraordinary things with someone in Anne, to the point that she is beginning to find herself the odd one out. Maybe it's my fault that we don't confide in each other. But Anne is not just sensitive, but strong as well. She accepts herself as she is and unwilling to change herself for others. That's just how things are, and unfortunately, they are not liable to change. Since the real friend is nowhere to be seen, the virtual friend would have to suffice. To enhance the image of this long-awaited friend in my imagination, I don't want to jot down the facts. I want the diary to be my friend, and I'm going to call this friend Kitty. Earlier, she seemed sure that nobody is going to bother reading the diary. But the moment she seems set to start writing, she is aware of the future readership. Her care and planning suggest that she does want her diary to be read. Since no one would understand a word of my stories to Kitty if I were to plunge right in, I'd better provide a brief sketch of my life, much as I dislike doing so. This will also help her making sense of her own life till that point. Kitty is told about Anne's family, her school, her teachers, the ones she loved and remembered. Grandma died in January 1942. No one knows how often I think of her and still love her. She doesn't talk about it often, and she probably feels alone in missing her. The four of us are still doing well, and that brings me to the present date of 20th June 1942 and the solemn dedication of my diary. Now it's time for the first formal entry, and Anne tells Kitty about what's going on in the school. Our entire class is quaking in its boots. The casual, almost sarcastic way of putting it means Anne is not one of the quakers. The reason, of course, is the forthcoming meeting in which the teachers decide who will move up to the next form and who will be kept back. So, it's that time of the year when the promotions and demotions are being decided. In those days, education was still a somewhat flexible institution, so there were staff meetings and discussions to discuss these promotions. Half the class is making bets. Well, that's weird. What does Anne think about her class? If you ask me, there are so many dummies that about a quarter of the class should be kept back. But teachers are the most unpredictable creatures on earth. Anne doesn't mince words. She tells the truth exactly as she sees it. These are signs of someone with a strong spirit. And she seems quite good at studies as well. I'm not so worried about my girlfriends and myself. We'll make it. The only subject I'm not sure about is maths. Mr. Keesing, the old fogey who teaches maths, was annoyed with me for ages because I talked so much. Slowly and steadily, the image of Anne is growing up into a curious combination. Till now, she seemed a lonely little girl without anyone to talk to. But now it seems she can't stop talking. She's not a typical 13-year-old. After several warnings, he assigned me extra homework. An essay on the subject, a chatterbox. Obviously, the assignment was supposed to give her few lessons. A chatterbox. What can you write about that? Maybe that was the idea. If she cannot write something about it, she won't feel justified about being one. That evening, I began thinking about the subject while chewing the tip of my fountain pen. The way she draws her own image is at once funny, cute, innocent, and introspective. She sounds like she's actually telling Kitty her great discovery that the assignment could be turned inside out. Anyone could ramble on and leave big spaces between the words, but the trick was to come up with convincing arguments to prove the necessity of talking. Anne seems to have a mischievous kind of intelligence. I thought, and suddenly I had an idea. I argued that talking is a student's trait, and that I would do my best to keep it under control, but that I would never be able to cure myself of the habit, since my mother talked as much as I did, if not more, and that there's not much you can do about inherited traits. It is a proof of a large spirit that she can make her alleged crime sound like an innocent truth, and be proud of it. Mr. Keesing decides to ridicule her chattering, but she, in turn, decided to ridicule her punishment for chattering, following all the laid rules. Mr. Keesing had a good laugh at my arguments. Maybe Anne thought that she had convinced him that talking is a healthy habit. But when I proceeded to talk my way through the next lesson, he assigned me a second essay. This time, it was supposed to be on an incorrigible chatterbox. She tasted some success on the matter, so she wasn't going to give up just yet. I handed it in, and Mr. Keesing had nothing to complain about for 2 whole lessons. It looks like Mr. Keesing is also enjoying this little pseudo-punishment game. However, during the 3rd lesson, he'd finally had enough. Anne Frank, as punishment for talking in class, write an essay entitled "Quack, Quack, Quack," said Mistress Chatterbox. The class roared. I had to laugh too, though I'd nearly exhausted my ingenuity on the topic of chatterboxes. She almost sounds glad to have a worthy challenge. It was time to come up with something else, something original. My friend San, who's good at poetry, offered to help me write the essay from beginning to end in verse, and I jumped for joy. Maybe, out of her own liveliness, she is trying to cure her teacher of grumpiness as well. Mr. Keesing was trying to play a joke on me with this ridiculous subject, but I'd make sure the joke was on him. There's no hostility though, just excitement. I finished my poem and it was beautiful. It was about a mother duck and a father swan with 3 baby ducklings who were bitten to death by the father because they quacked too much. Surely, Mr. Keesing wouldn't do the same to the poor ducklings in his class. Luckily, Mr. Keesing took the joke the right way. He read the poem to the class, adding his own comments, and to several other classes as well. Since then, I've been allowed to talk and haven't been assigned any extra homework. On the contrary, she managed to give some sense of humor to her teacher. Mr. Keesing's always making jokes these days. Yours, Anne.
Thank you. Let me take up the analysis now. Let's start with the language first. The most striking feature of the language as a diary entry is its unrestrained, fearless honesty, making the language a clear mirror of Anne's own personality. It is by turns sweet and sensitive. On the surface, I seem to have everything except my one true friend. No one knows how often I think of her and still love her. At times, it is much more contemplative and introspective, as if dealing with open questions. Paper has more patience than people. Let me put it more clearly, since no one will believe that a 13-year-old girl is completely alone in the world. Then it is very firm and confident at places as well. In any case, that's just how things are, and unfortunately, they're not liable to change. Anyone could ramble on and leave big spaces between the words, but the trick was to come up with convincing arguments to prove the necessity of talking. And lastly, the occasional doses of a great sense of humor complete a truly beautiful portrait of a vibrant young girl. I would never be able to cure myself of the habit, since my mother talked as much as I did, if not more, and that there's not much you can do about inherited traits. It was time to come up with something else, something original. I'd make sure the joke was on him. Now let us look at the major themes. Loneliness and diary writing. The given excerpt deals with a time in Anne's life when she was still living a somewhat normal life as a somewhat normal schoolgirl. Her sensitivity had somewhat secluded her from people around her, children as well as adults. She was very functional, yet very lonely. The decision to find a virtual friend in her diary was driven by her need to express the absence of a true friend in her life. As she mentioned, paper is more patient than people. Diaries and journals have similarly rescued many people from the shores of seclusion and alienation. Even though, in the modern technology-driven world, there are thousands of devices and distractions, a diary continues to hold its amazing value as the patient, non-judgmental recipient of raw and ripe emotions alike. Student-teacher relationship. Anne was a calm, clever student, clearly far better than most children in her form. When her talkative nature proves a jutting thorn for her maths teacher and is punished for it, she turns the punishment into an adventure of rhetorics and persuasion. The willingness of Mr. Keesing to acknowledge her brilliance in the adventure proves the softer side of student-teacher relationship. Anne and Mr. Keesing managed to have some kind of bonding over a series of punishments. Anne discovers a valuable ability and Mr. Keesing develops a sense of humor. Thank you everyone for a great session.